President-elect Donald Trump cabinet currently and filling other key positions in the federal government. Governor Susana Martinez met with Vice President-elect Mike Pence this week. Governor Martinez was critical of the Trump campaign and him, of course, during the campaign, but this week she publicly defended Mr. Trump's decision to make Steve Bannon, the controversial former head of Breitbart News, his chief strategist in the White House. Now, what's on your mind this week as you watch the Trump team prepare for transition? Get in touch with us here at New Mexico in Focus at newmexicoinfocus.org or find us certainly on Facebook or Twitter. Our line of panelists are here to share their thoughts. I'm joined at the table this week by Tom Garrity from the Garrity Group PR, Laura Sanchez-Rive, one of our regulars and an attorney at Cuddy & McCarthy LLP, Inez Russell Gomez, she's editorial page editor at the Santa Fe New Mexican, and our friend Trip Jennings, executive director of New Mexico In Depth. Tom, seems like Governor Martinez is trying to repair that relationship. It was interesting watching the body English of her on that panel with Mike Pence and others this week. Seems like we've made up. We never know what's going on behind the scenes. But given the background of where she was with Mr. Trump previously, good strategy just to go there and just kind of do her thing?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, I think there's, one thing she hasn't done is, say I'm sorry that she didn't support the president-elect. And I think that's good. You know, she's remaining true to her brand, to her colors, and so to speak. But when you look at what, she's really doing right now as far as making friends with the vice president, who's in charge of the transition team, trying to position New Mexico in front of a lot of very high-profile, changes that are coming down the pike, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, whether it's changes to the energy industry, or even elementary and secondary education. So, a lot of these issues are things that could impact New Mexico. So I think it's smart for her to really be going out right now, extending that olive branch. And she's kind of covering one base while Congressman Steve Pearce, who's very strong, is taking care of the other bases. So between the two of them, we'll have to see how successful they are in defending for New Mexico as the Trump administration takes shape.
Inez, I have to imagine that for our governor, a lot of the education work she's going to be doing is educating this new administration basically about who we are, what our strengths are, what we do. Do you know what I mean? We got to get to that at some point because it seemed clear to me from Mr. Trump's first visit in May, then his last one just before the election, he doesn't know much about us. I don't think he'd ever been here before. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's a reason there's one of our 50 is missing feature is that people forget that New Mexico is here, that it's a state, that it has other traditions. I mean, if you're talking about dislike of immigrants and Mexican Americans, you've got a whole immigration issue with our border, and you've also got the reality that New Mexico is bilingually a two Spanish and English country, so we couldn't have English only here if that's something they wanted to do nationally. I think there also needs to be education about Indian tribes because Donald Trump has dealt with them in his role as a casino executive and hasn't always been very friendly or very complimentary. And we have a lot of federal dealings when it comes to tribes and governments that they are going to have to be educated upon.
That's a very good point. I hadn't even thought about that. The idea that, again, I'm musing in my own mind's eye, Laura, about this conversation between potentially our governor and President-elect Trump. In that, how does she thread the needle on things like immigration? Do you know what I mean? She's got people to answer to here, but at the same time, this administration has laid down a hard marker about what they're going to do to undocumented folks here.
Well, I would expect very carefully is the easy answer.
Right.
But I don't know how she walks that line, to be honest, because it's so clear that New Mexico was not supportive of Trump's rhetoric. I think you saw when he visited here in May the kinds of reaction that you got from people who were protesting. People just don't, that message didn't resonate with folks in New Mexico. And I think even the Republican Party wasn't fully embracing the Trump message. So I think that, of course, there's regional differences as well. I think there's, a lot of the supporters that helped and have continuously shown up for Pierce might resonate a little bit better with that kind of a message, but by and large, I think the rest of New Mexico is going to have a real problem. So she's going to have to walk a very fine line, I think. But a lot of it also depends on what she's looking at next.
Very good point there. Medicare, Medicaid, ACA was mentioned earlier. These are very important things for us here at Trip Jennings. Again, how does she thread a needle and say, look, Speaker Ryan has his ideas about Medicaid, but we need to be looked at, meaning New Mexico, uniquely. We cannot be compared to Virginia or Connecticut or California. That's a tough pitch.
I
it
mean,
seems to me.
she's a governor who actually, did say Medicaid expansion. She agreed. She was one of the Republican governors that did go for that. So Medicaid is very important. We have hundreds of thousands of people on that program. With Medicare, that's going to be interesting because one thing. This is a political kind of I think around politics. That's a lot of folks who vote. And so, that's kind of tough when you're talking about doing what they're talking about with Medicare and making adjustments. With the ACA, that is a huge law.
Yep.
And President-elect Trump has already started to say, well, I might keep some of these things here. Keeping someone on, a son or a daughter till the age of 26, pre-existing conditions. My question here, and maybe someone can answer it, is individual mandate in ACA is like the thing that's holding everything together because of the insurers that's what brought them to the table back in 2010, actually. You need shared risk with insurance. So what's going to happen with that? So I'm kind of interested to see what he really does with ACA.
Think about it, let's kind of tease this out a little bit. If you think about it, Inez Russell, that let's say Speaker Ryan gets his way and Medicaid takes a ding and the ACA is reworked a little bit. It seems to me we would have to really hustle because we would have all kinds of challenges that would become more challenging at that point with our diminishing, economy, all that kind of a thing. You see what I mean? It could be very, very tricky for us unless someone's really fighting out there for us.
Right, and New Mexico is interesting because most insurance is related to our jobs. We have a lot of people here who are artists, who are other kinds of professions that they work very hard, they're not even poor, but they don't have a job that comes with insurance.
Right.
So what Obamacare did is give them an opportunity to purchase in the private market with subsidies. And those subsidies have been incredibly important to people being able to buy insurance.
Right.
So if that goes away, there are going to be a lot of people who aren't covered. And I think at the end of the day, whatever they want to do to basically still damage President Obama as opposed to change the law to improve it, they're going to have to deal with the reality that a lot of people are alive who wouldn't be alive because they have insurance. Does that not mean they shouldn't fix costs, they shouldn't do some other things? Yes, fix whatever's wrong, but I think we should quit talking about repealing Obamacare, ACA, and talk about how do we ensure people have access to health care.
Right. Think about that if you would, Laura, because again, if you think about mixing ACA, but also let's assume they go to a block grant scheme for Medicaid. Where does New Mexico fit into that? Because that's a difficulty. Again, if we have to, eat our own gruel, so to speak, that becomes very, very difficult at a certain level.
It does, and New Mexico is one of only 2 states that did a hybrid sort of combination of the program. So when there was a lot of adjustments that had to be made, I think the other one was Idaho, that did this sort of hybrid state and federal type of an exchange that we set up here. So going to a block grant, I think really changes things quite a bit for the state. We'd have to figure out how to take that money and sort of develop our own, and I don't know that we have that kind of market here. I mean, you need competition. We have a couple of very strong or very big providers, and others that are growing. But I'm not sure that we have the kind of system that would immediately flourish with that kind of a block grant.
Well
system.
said. Tom, a quick change of subject. We're back to another subject. The idea that's out there right now, we've seen a lot of articles about deportations or threats of deportations. We've got folks in Santa Fe talking to young people about this. We've got APS sending letters home to parents about how to talk to the kids about this because children are upset about this. They've heard this now for a year or so, and they've heard no significant turnaround from Mr. Trump so far about this idea. When I think about this in the dark of night, it seems to, what worries me is New Mexico would be a prime place if this administration wanted to prove a point about running people out of this country. This would be a ground zero place to do it. We've had it happen in Hatch. We've been down this road before. That kind of scenario really scares me at some level.
Yeah, and when you look at the whole issue of immigration, New Mexico has, really it's been a big story here, but on a national basis, the narrative has really been focused on California, Arizona, and Texas.
Right.
New Mexico, if for some, unforeseen reason, it's just unfathomable to me. I mean, how to think that could possibly happen here.
I know.
The administration could make a great point. A very significant point is what I mean here in New Mexico. And so I think it's, but to your point earlier about talking about starting that conversation, I think it's very important, to have that happen, because there's a lot of fear. And when children are in fear, they're not able to learn. And, what we're going to need to do is just start that conversation, get people talking about it. I hope it doesn't come to that scenario that you suggested.
Exactly, and let's pick up on that if you would too. Northern New Mexico, same scenario, envisioning people coming and taking parents and children and all this kind of thing. Well, almost unthinkable here.
It is unthinkable. And when you think about, there was a promise during the campaign to deport 11 million illegal immigrants, supposedly. Now it's down to 2 to 3 million supposedly criminal people. However, reading the New York Times this week, there's not 2 to 3 million people that fit that category. It's more like 1 point whatever, and not all of those are felonies, not all of those are the dangerous, creepy people that we all want away from us. So even taking that many people involves increasing the immigration police, it involves raids, it involves the kinds of things that we in America say we don't want. And I can't imagine on Airport Road in South Santa Fe that we want a bunch of people, coming around with lights and foghorns and dogs to pick up our neighbors.
That's right.
And the mayor of Santa Fe, Javier Gonzalez, has been doing a national media tour this week, basically saying Santa Fe will remain a sanctuary city, that the city's not going to cooperate. And I can tell you that most residents won't either. Some people are afraid and want immigrants gone because they're just living in fear. But most of the city, even the local Hispanics who, get worried because people call them Mexicans, even those people for the most part do not want to see little children crying because their parents are being deported.
Good point there. Now, when we come back to the line, we'll look at how results in elections across the state will reshape the legislature this coming January. Excellent last word there.